Let's proceed further with the reading. So till now we have understood what was the worthy purpose described by Wordsworth and how his own work in lyrical ballads, the poems in this volume of lyrical ballads, he describes they all have certain worthy purpose, and then he describes how I achieved this purpose, how whatever objects of descriptions I've selected in this particular volume, they all have some purpose, and how that purpose originated because he had been rigorously into this habit of maintaining contemplation. He was into this habit of contemplation and the feelings that get excited once this habit of contemplation give rises to the excitement of those feelings. So let's proceed further, and the textual reading and let me start reading from the text. For all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but though this be true, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects, but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. Now, this particular phrase, good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, or simply, poetry is nothing but the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Now, this is a very popular adage, a very popular catchphrase of the moment you define what is romanticism, the first thing that comes up to any layperson's mind is, how Wordsworth defined poetry as simply a reflection of, or as the spontaneous overflow, or the quick overflow of powerful feelings. But what does he mean here? So there are a couple of things that has gone into this particular theorization. First is, he says, all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but there is a secondary attachment to it, which is produced by a man who possesses more than usual organic sensibility, someone who has long and deep thoughts. So poetry is just not limited to spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Rather, the poet, when he's recalling those powerful emotions, those powerful feelings, need to possess something of called organic sensibility, and more than that usual organic sensibility. And what is the thing that he needs to possess? That is, he must have a long and deep thoughts about it as well. Now let's first make an attempt to understand what is organic sensibility. The word organic simply means something which is natural, something which is not man-made. We say organic food, organic vegetable, something which are not man-made, which is not artificially grown. The organic vegetables which are not artificially grown. Now here when he says organic sensibility obviously the perception. So organic sensibility simply means the basic natural mental capacities, the basic natural perception, sense perception of human beings. The fact that we are emotionally conscious beings, even animals are emotionally conscious beings, but there is this element called profundity, there is this element called deep penetrating sagaciousness that is endowed to human beings and which is absent in animals. So this emotional consciousness, this profound perception consciousness, this sensitiveness is something which is unique, which is something distinctive to human beings. This must be, so this is just the part of usual organic sensibility. This must be there with the poet, who should also have deep and long thoughts. Now what does he mean here? Ideation behind the poetic theory of Wordsworth. This is, good poetry is never an immediate reaction to the provoking cause, that our sensations must be allowed some time, that our sensations must be given some time to sink back into the common fund of our experience, there to find their level and due proportion. Or when the mind in the act of contemplation, when the mind in the act of recalling, when the mind in the act of taking out or rummaging all those thoughts from the brain, that is the act of contemplation, it revives the old sensations, and out of that union of the contemplating mind and the receiving sensibility. Out of this union of mind and sensibility rises the unique mood of expression which we call poetry. Okay, so till now we have discussed Wordsworth's definition of poetry, that is, good poetry is something, or all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and we tried to unravel all these terms, what they conceptually meant, because as I told you earlier as well, Wordsworth has been one of the most oversimplified and partially read poet whose poetic theory was completely misled, completely simplified for the taste of, say, common folk. So what he says that it should be written in the commonplace language used by real. So he said it should be written in commonplace language used by real folks, but commonplace thoughts, they are incompatible with poetic passion. Why? Because he is the poet who believed that a great poet, ideally a great poet, should raise people up to his own level rather than descend to theirs. So do not get confused with when he says good poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that erupt in tranquility after that tranquility has gone. So whatever definition he gives, this is not the simplified way of saying that good poetry is about reflecting upon or giving voice to your feelings. No, that's not the case. Rather, a great poet, as per Mr. Wordsworth, is someone who actually raises the spirits of the people. And how he raises it? He raises the scope by widening the sphere of human sensibility so as to strengthen man's capacities for man with an apostrophe S, man's capacities for deeper contemplative response towards object. So the moment I see daffodil or a tree or a mountain cliff or a water stream, my only response should not be just wow, how beautiful it is, and it remains up till that level only. That is just a very ordinary way of responding to something, isn't it? Even a child can make sense of when he sees sense of the same objects when he looks at a waterfall or a water stream or even a higher mountain cliff, right? So what does a poet offers here? The poet will offer himself through his poetry, his own experience of that particular object. And if you remember yesterday when I gave you one of the quiz questions, I deliberately misled you into that question where what is the crux of Wordsworth's poetry? And I mentioned that he's the conveyor of his past feelings or future feelings or present feelings. I deliberately gave these wrong options. So the idea was, with the use of his own hyper-acute perceptions and experiences through different objects, and we'll dwell more on this term, hyper-acute perceptions and experiences. How do they generate? How do they originate in the first place? So through his hyper-acute perceptions and experiences, he makes the common men and women and common people, the humanity, experience these natural objects in its optimum form. Their sensibilities get expanded. Their sensibilities get augmented when a great poet or simply when a good poet supplies or give such kind of poetry. Now, I hope this much is clear, that how a poet recreates a past mood and past experience in order to communicate that experience to his readers forms the content of his poetry, forms the content of good poetry that he specifically defines. And if I simply say that good poetry, being the spontaneous, so-called definition, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, is not just limited to it. Rather, when a poet someone who is more than just the organic sensibility, who possesses higher sensibilities than just being an organic sense of things, only those kind of people or only that kind of poet can bring out good poetry, right? This is what till here we discussed. But if we go a bit further, how would they decide that amid my past mood and past experiences, which feelings I have to take up? Of course, so the idea is the poet, when they're trying to contemplate it in past, when the poet is in meditative recollection, is trying to take out a feeling or is trying to rummage through that particular feeling, which is summoned from the past, which is called up from the past, and using that contemplating mind as well as the sensibility that now got created, the union of these two, bringing these two together harmoniously gives rise to the feeling of another sensation, another unique mood, another unique feeling, and that unique feeling is what forms the content of that poetic piece. So the emotion that rises not from the direct experience of that object, the emotion that rises not from the immediate confrontation of the object, but or rather from a contemplation at a distance from an object conceived or a feeling, or when a feeling is recalled, right? And if you remember, I said earlier too that poetry is born in contemplation, in the meditative recollection of a feeling taken from the past. This is what exactly I meant. That is, poetry doesn't, as per Mr. Wordsworth, poetry should not be formed or it should not be composed with some direct experience of the object or immediate confrontation of it. Rather, the emotion that rises from that contemplation after some time at a distance, or when that particular feeling is recalled, only then the content of poetry is formed. Now you can raise a question here, ma'am, does it mean that when Alexander Pope, when he sat down and thought about composing few lines on Arabella Farmer of Rape of the Lock, he was also indulging in exactly this kind of activity? His emotion were not the experience of the direct, his emotions did not rise from the direct experience. He did not had any, say, immediate confrontation. Rather, he maybe after a month or 2 months or 6 months, a year or few years, he sat down and he contemplated at a distance, right? Or he recalled that particular feeling. Then how is he different from Mr. Wordsworth? After all, both of them have involved themselves into a similar activity. Then how come both of them are different?